Hey everyone, welcome back to Little Firefly Artworks. We're back working on Kind-Eyed Rainbow again. If you are new here, I would recommend that you go and watch episode 1 for this series first, so that you have a little bit of context for how we got here, because in this episode I'm going to talk you through my process of finishing the lorikeet. And also, I suppose, my process of avoidance and procrastination. I boldly decided that I was going to start working on the chest first, but I didn't stick with that for very long because of how big this area is. Anyway, I did still go through and add some rough feather shapes with permanent red. Here, the feathers are kind of more shaped like scales, so I basically just draw scales. And I'm also trying to show the curvature of the breast and give like a sense of perspective with the feathers that are on the front side, the ones that will curl around to the side we can't see. I also try to make it look like they're layering over each other, and will eventually fill in parts of the background to kind of help with that. I use Tuscan Red and Crimson Lake for the shadowed sections and add Poppy Red to my rotation for the feathers that are closer to the yellow patches, because it's a little bit more orange. Although I kind of dived right into this section, I was actually pretty nervous about it, which is evidently why I almost immediately switched to a different section. But this is basically because I really liked how the head looked, and I think I was kind of trying to lie to myself about my state of overwhelm, and I thought that I could potentially overcome it by just doing the next most time-consuming part. And yeah, my logic was flawed, but that's a whole nother issue. I use kelp green to make adjustments to the background, again following the brush strokes to try and hide the pencil. And then here is my first deviation from my original plan of attack. It didn't take me long to full on nope out of the second largest area. I don't know why I thought it was a good idea to start with it, but you know, here we are. I start adding in the section beneath the wing. I use a mix of shades here, building feather textures and prominent points of interest while still trying to make it look like it's not getting as much sunlight as the rest of the lorikeet. I build feather textures and colour layer by layer, kind of like how I did on the face, using sharp, dark pencils to clean up the lines for individual bristles and more precise details. I only added a small amount of highlight to the ends of some of the feathers before finishing up this area with 90% cool grey and black to desaturate the darkest parts a little bit. I think I gravitated to this blue section because I'd already used those colours for the head and it was just a little bit familiar. Anyway, once I'm happy with this section, I briefly return to adding some more of the red feathers on the chest, adding some transitional feathers between the yellow and red sections with orange, and between the head and the chest with black cherry. I add a few more bristle details to the tips of the darker feathers on the neck with 30% warm grey and greyed lavender. I did want some of them to pop just a little bit more, so I used white for those specific spots. I did experiment with my use of colour here. Trying to get the feathers to look how I wanted them to was a bit more challenging than I had originally expected. I was pretty disappointed and unenthused by how they looked. They were too blockish and looked much more like scales than feathers. What a surprise when, you know, that's what I was originally aiming to do, with the plan to add more detail later. But I noped out of doing this area again and decided instead to work on the back of the lorikeet's head. Why I didn't just do this area next after finishing the head, I'm not sure. It kind of was the part that would have made the most sense, but it's probably because I had to fix up the part where I had to draw over the painted background. I think it intimidated me just a little bit too much, but it's been a year since I finished this artwork, so I don't necessarily remember everything. I added some rough feather shapes along the transition to the darker green feathers with apple green to establish where I was working, and then just go through and use that to block in the whole section. I'm kind of trying to match the colour to the area that's being drawn over the painted surface in an attempt to hide the difference when I layer lighter colours over it later. I wasn't entirely sure if this approach would work, but it kind of does, as you're about to see. I used grass green to add some darker feather details along the edge of the blue section before blending it out with some lighter greens. And as you can kind of see by the amount of pencil dust that I'm making, I did end up pressing pretty hard, probably too hard, colouring over the darker spot. It didn't help much in hindsight, and I potentially just made it harder for myself to add more intricate detail later, since it's really hard to layer Prismacolors over areas where you've already packed down a lot of the Prismacolor pigment. But I was very focused on making sure that the difference between the two sections of this part of the head vanished. On the areas of the lorikeet where the feathers are just a solid colour, there's nowhere near as much intricate kind of colour popping out. So I kind of basically just decided to start with the mid-tone colour that everything is, and then build detail on top of that with darker colours and lighter colours, rather than going from light to dark or dark to light, whichever I'd preferred to do for the head. So I added thin dashed lines of marine green in the rough shape of a semicircle or half oval, trying to create the look of shadows from the bristles of the feathers laid over the top of other feathers. And then I would blend the lines into the lighter green to make them a little bit less sharp. Once I'd added the shadows, I came back through to add the highlight colours to the parts between the shadows to try and make it look like the individual bristles are reflecting light. It just kind of makes them stand out a little bit more. I'm not sure if that's an overly convoluted way of explaining what I'm doing here, but basically I'm building the shadows first, blending that into the feather beneath, and then adding the highlights to kind of try and tie it all together. This part of the head or neck was actually slightly out of focus in the reference photo, so I kind of just tried to mimic that. And then I start adding some Prussian green as a base colour to the next section I was flirting with the idea of working on. I also decide to make a few more darker areas on the back of the head and use my colourless blender to soften them a bit. I then ended up using the blender to blur the back part of the head out over the background, adding a few more pigments here and there to help with the blur effect. And then, proper Amy fashion, I brush away some loose pencil dust with my hand and somehow completely forget that I'm holding a white pencil while I'm doing it. Yeah, I see it past Amy. It's pretty obvious. Nice job. Hopefully the Prismacolor eraser I got can lift that. Kind of. I keep fussing with the blurry section here before deciding to add a bit more of a prominent glaze to some parts of the lorikeet's face, increasing the shadows in some areas and the highlights in others. I know I said I had it finished in the last episode, but hey, it looks pretty good after I do this. I then decide that I want to try returning to work on the chest. And my idea to try and work up the confidence to finish this area is that I choose to first roughly add in some of the yellow feather shapes. And then to make the area appear smaller, as if that's possible, I roughly add in some of the feathers that transition from yellow to green and sketch out the edge of the wing. Then, as if anyone is surprised, I ditch the chest almost immediately to colour what is visible of the flight feathers, deciding that it's a smaller area and would be a little bit easier to work on. Since there isn't a green that 100% matches the lorikeet green, and to be honest, I actually think the way these feathers are coloured, they'll never be just one shade of green. I won't bore you with the whole science of it, I'm also not much of a scientist, but it's actually an illusion, kind of. Basically, a lorikeet's blue feathers have microscopic air pockets that absorb every wavelength of light except for blue, which is why they appear blue, because they reflect that back. And the green feathers kind of do the same thing, but the blue light has to pass through yellow pigment that is in the feathers and thus appears green. Google it if you want to know more, it's actually pretty cool. Anyway, while I was working on this area, the tape was really getting on my last nerve, so I removed it. I'm also layering several different shades of green to achieve what my husband likes to call an NMM. Let's try that again. I'm also layering several different shades of green to achieve what my husband likes to call an NMM look. I start with the darker hues and build up to the highlights, using pale sage to kind of blend all of them together. I leave the extreme highlights until the end and often glaze over them with some of the mid-tone greens to just kind of tone them down. Also, I feel like white and grey-green light both look too cool, and if I glazed over the top of them with the mid-tone greens, it would make them look a little warmer. I then sketched the rest of the feathers on the wing and added some more feather details where the green feathers merged with the yellow part of the chest. I did also notice an area here that I had made a mistake with the flight feathers, but I decided to just move on and come back to it later. And then I moved to working on the shoulder, which is another part that's on the smaller side and didn't intimidate me anywhere near as much as the other areas. The feathers on the shoulder look a little bit more like fur, since the fan or scale-like shape of the feathers is kind of obscured by the curve of the lorikeet's back. The far side of the shoulder is also a little bit more blue-toned because it's reflecting more of the sky than the feathers on the wing, so I adjust my colour use to reflect this while also making some more adjustments to the background. One of the first things I focused on here was fixing up the area where I had coloured over the background and layering down another base of pigment. It's kind of the opposite to what I was doing for the lighter green section. I choose here to add the shadows of the bristles first and then build the midtones and highlights after, blending apple green, grass green and olive green. There are some sections that have a more warm green tone, for which I also blend lime peel in with my other greens to try and achieve. I then start to build some more feather textures above the wing, focusing on adding the darker parts first, and then just layering my other greens over the top. I keep alternating between all of my greens to build the texture of the bristles and to make it look like the feathers are overlapping. I actually had a lot of fun with this part. It's a relatively small detail, but when you kind of add all of it up, it actually starts to look really good and it had me pretty excited. If you go back to look at my Instagram posts from about a year ago when I was making this artwork, there's a post I made about doing this particular section, and I talked about how I initially thought the shoulder was pretty meh. It did start out as a mess of colour that didn't have a whole lot of detail, but with persistence and a little bit of effort, I got it pretty close to the reference photo. And then to finish this area off, I come through with my darker greens and 90% cool grey to darken the darkest shadows and make some of the bristles stand out a little bit more. Then I work in some final touches with highlights and return to the feathers on the chest. And I haven't really got much of a choice at this point, since the wing was a lot more intimidating than the chest, so here I am. Anyway, I'm doing a whole load of blending, building transitions and continuity between different sections of colour, and experimenting with layering shadows and highlights to build the texture of the feathers. The more I work through adding these details, the more confident I get, and the easier it gets to push myself to continue working through this section. Funny how it works like that. I start using Deco Peach alongside Blush Pink as my red highlight because the Blush Pink is slightly more cool and it was making some of the more orangey red feathers just look a bit off. And then I just keep trucking along adding details. It actually surprised me how much I was able to make the feathers that looked too blocky work by adding just a few lines. And to think I procrastinated working on this area for so long because of them. I think it had ended up being about 2.5 hours by this point. That's also only the time that I was actually recording, so time that I was actually sitting down drawing. I can't actually remember if I didn't touch the artwork for a couple of days because I thought it looked so bad. And autofocus really wasn't my friend for this area, but I basically continued layering, adding shadows and highlights and rotating through different colours. I tried to work down row by row, but you know me. A side note, something I've learned while recording the voiceover for this video is how to lock focus onto a specific thing and, turn down the sensitivity of the autofocus so that it's not constantly focusing on my hand instead of the artwork. I really, really promise that one of these days my videos won't be so novice and that I'll eventually learn how to properly use my camera. Since the yellow feathers were lighter than the red ones, it was actually slightly more difficult to make the highlights stand out with them. I ended up using a lot more white than I thought I would, but I would also gently layer over it with cream, lemon yellow, or deco yellow so that it wasn't so white, for lack of a better word. And here's where I properly start fixing up the scale feathers at the top of the chest. I think that my choice to add some orange and yellow hues as the highlights really worked, and I wish I had have done it from the start instead of relying a little bit too much on the pinks, since they made some of the other feathers feel more pink than red. Luckily, the Prismacolors are pretty forgiving. Like I've said before, it was pretty important to use sharp pencils when I was adding the bristle details. If they were blunt, the lines would end up being too thick and not as clean as I wanted them to be, and required me to go back through with my darker pencils a lot more to clean them up, which my darker pencils also had to be sharp. I chose to add a few more greens to the transition between the back of the head and the lorikeet's face, blending them out into what I'd already done there before returning to building texture and details on the lorikeet's chest. The part where the green feathers peek through the yellow ones was a little frustrating, since if I wasn't careful, the yellow pencils would pick up the green pigment and then blend it into the yellow where I wasn't intending it to be, which happened more than once, and I just tried to make it look like I'd done it on purpose. I think if I was smarter, I would have added the yellow areas first. Towards the end of working on this artwork, my Prussian green was driving me properly insane because it was constantly breaking off. I've literally never dropped this pencil and have since read that it's a pretty common complaint from people who use the Prismacolors. Unfortunately, this isn't the first time it's happened, and I doubt it will be the last, but I kind of managed to make do while I waited for my new pencil to arrive. Around this point, I remember getting slightly concerned that the amount of bristle detail that I was putting on the feathers might be a little bit too distracting. Now that it's finished, I'm still not entirely sure whether or not they are, but I'm also incredibly happy with how it turned out. I think in my head it was either to have the bristle details in the feathers or risk them starting to look a lot more like scales. As I move towards the bottom of the lorikeet's belly, the colours are a lot less vibrant, so I start using new colours and changing it up with other ones that I'm using to help make the feathers look like they're not receiving as much light, which basically means I'm just using more oranges and browns. And as I work further down, I make more adjustments to the background. With the chest finished, now the only thing I have left to do is the wing. The first part of the wing that I chose to work on was fixing up the flight feathers, and I didn't get the manual focus spot on for this. My apologies. But once I'm happy with how the flight leathers, I suppose that kind of makes sense, but not for what I'm talking about. Once I'm happy with how the flight feathers look, I go through and add the shadows for the next row. When I'm trying to make feathers look like they're gleaming, I find it easiest to work from dark to light. This was the best way to build the specific shade of green that I was after. I think I ended up actually using all of the green Prismacolors at least once while making this artwork. I did get a little bit disheartened by the fact that I had made some minor misjudgments in scale when I was originally sketching in the feathers on the wing. And when I went through and resketched, I knew I couldn't fix the parts that I'd already added, so I just did my best to make it work. In the reference photo, the wing is also slightly out of focus, which is why I don't spend as much time adding individual feather bristles textures here, but the feathers on the wing are also kind of designed a little bit differently to the feathers on the body. They kind of hold their shape a lot more and they aren't as fluffy. They do kind of look like shiny fish scales though. Until I add them all, then it kind of makes sense. I continued working my way around the wing until all of the feathers were finished. And I also forgot that I was wearing a towel on my head, and I accidentally blocked the camera with it a few times here. My bad. And another note to myself is if I have a shower and wash my hair before I sit down and do some drawing, don't wear a white towel. It's very distracting for the camera. I think adding the fur-like textures was one of my favourite parts of drawing Kind-Eyed Rainbow. I'm not entirely sure why, but I just loved being able to watch the detail come to life. And as I mentioned in the description for my last episode, I changed the way that I do my overlays. I was originally animating each color tile individually in DaVinci Resolve Fusion, which was a headache to learn how to do for someone who is not the most patient person and before this had no experience editing. But I did kind of learn to enjoy it. It was a bit like a puzzle. The only issue was it would take me upwards of 2 or 3 weeks to finish doing all of the overlays for each video, and if I had made mistakes that I noticed after rendering, I'd have to go back and spend more time fixing up those mistakes and then re-render because my PC just could not handle any kind of playback. Anyway, I ended up making all of my new color info tiles with swatches I created in Procreate in Aquamotion, which was also another interesting program to have to learn how to use. And I now exclusively edit on Final Cut. Overlays now only take me about 4 hours, depending on the length of the video, and rendering does not take longer than a few hours. I can't believe how much time I would waste with my previous videos, just thinking it was normal. And that is how I created Kind-Eyed Rainbow. This artwork was a mission and had its fair share of ups and downs. I learned a lot about myself creating it, and I have another example of how much I doubt my abilities and how much I end up looking like an idiot by the end for doubting myself. I think I used upwards of 60 individual colours, and I had to do a pretty large order to restock all of my pencils when I was finished. I also always forget how I store the colours in my pencil case when I'm packing them away, so I frequently end up having to reorganise the whole thing. I hope that you guys enjoyed watching and that a peek into my inner dialogue helps you in some way to overcome your doubts in your own creative endeavours. If it has, I'd love to see your creations and read your stories in the comments. But until next time, take care and don't forget to stay inspired.